Hey, welcome! You know, the word narcissist gets thrown around a lot these days, right? It's everywhere. But it's usually used more like a casual insult than a real clinical term. So today, we're going to cut through all that noise. We're going to dig into the actual, evidence-based reality of what we call Narcissistic Personality Disorder, or NPD. So that's the big question we're tackling. What is narcissism really? When a clinician gives a formal diagnosis, what does that actually mean? To get our heads around that, we've got to build this thing from the ground up, piece by piece.
And here's our game plan. We'll start with the absolute basics of personality. Then we'll find out where NPD fits in the whole clinical landscape. After that, we'll break down the official diagnostic checklist, explore its different phases, and finally, see how it's actually measured. All right, let's jump right in.
Okay, first up, we've got to clear up some really common confusion. You hear people use words like trait and personality as if they're the same thing. But clinically, the difference between a single trait, a whole personality, and a full-blown disorder is absolutely fundamental. And trust me, getting this right is step one.
So think of a personality trait like a single ingredient in a super complex recipe. It's just a consistent tendency you have, like being really outgoing, or maybe you're super conscientious. We all have these traits on a spectrum, and having any one of them, even something like being a bit antagonistic, isn't automatically a problem. It's just one part of a much, much bigger picture. Personality, then, is the entire recipe. It's the finished dish. It's how all those different traits come together in a stable, organized way. This whole combination is what creates your unique style of seeing the world and interacting with it. A healthy personality can mix traits flexibly, balancing confidence with empathy, for example.
And this is where we cross the line into what we call a disorder. It happens when those traits become so rigid, so extreme, and so inflexible that they cause serious long-term problems. It's like the person gets stuck seeing the world through this one distorted, unchangeable lens, and it just leads to massive impairment in their life and their relationships.
Okay, so we've got our foundation. Now, where does NPD fit into all of this? Well, in clinical diagnosis, personality disorders are grouped into clusters based on things they have in common, and NPD lives in a very specific neighborhood.
The official guide that clinicians use, the DSM-5, puts these disorders into three main groups. You've got Cluster A, the odd and eccentric ones. Then there's Cluster C, which covers the anxious and fearful disorders. And right smack in the middle, you have Cluster B, the one known for being dramatic, emotional, and erratic. This is NPD's home turf, and as you can see, it has some pretty intense neighbors.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because this chart gets right to the heart of what makes these disorders different. It's all about the core motivation. On the surface, they might all look dramatic or manipulative, but the why behind the behavior is completely different. For NPD, the driving force, the engine, is this relentless, desperate need to maintain a superior self-image, and they do that by getting praise and admiration from other people. It's not just any attention. It has to be attention that confirms how special they are.
So just how common is this? Well, major studies like the huge National Epidemiologic Survey on Alcohol and Related Conditions estimate that NPD affects up to 6.2% of the adult population. To put that in perspective, that actually makes it the most common disorder in Cluster B, and frankly, way more common than most people assume.
All right, with all that context set up, let's get to the main event, the clinical core. What does a professional actually look for when diagnosing narcissistic personality disorder? This is where we get into the official checklist.
But before we just rattle off a list of symptoms, you have to understand this one crucial point. That outward arrogance, that grandiosity we all associate with narcissism, it is not, I repeat, not a sign of genuine self-love. It's actually a rigid defense mechanism, like a suit of armor, protecting an incredibly fragile and unstable sense of self that is totally dependent on what other people think.
So to get a formal diagnosis, a person has to show a persistent pattern of behavior that meets at least 5 of the following 9 official criteria. It's not about having 1 or 2 of these traits on a bad day. It's about a pervasive, dysfunctional pattern that shows up again and again.
And here they are, the 9 official criteria. You can kind of see how they fall into a few themes, right? First, you've got this inflated sense of self, that grandiosity, the fantasies of unlimited success, this belief that they're special. Second, there's this bottomless need for validation from others, needing constant admiration, that sense of entitlement. And finally, you see the devastating impact on relationships, exploiting people, a total lack of empathy, and that arrogant or envious attitude. A person has to consistently show at least 5 of these to even be considered for the diagnosis.
So how is this different from just being really confident? It's a great question.
Well, healthy self-confidence is based in reality. It's earned, and it can handle constructive criticism. Pathological narcissism, it's based on an inflated fantasy and it absolutely shatters when it's criticized. Healthy confidence allows for empathy and give and take, whereas in NPD, relationships are just tools to serve the ego.
And this example just nails the difference in practice. Look at Ines. She has healthy confidence, so when she makes a mistake, she can admit it, apologize, and learn from it. Why? Because her self-worth comes from the inside. It's stable. But Paulo? No way. For him, a failure is a direct attack on his entire sense of self, so he has to get enraged, blame someone else, and basically rewrite reality to protect that fragile ego.
Now, it's really easy to picture that loud, arrogant, stereotypical narcissist. But clinically, NPD is not a monolith. It can actually show up in very different, even opposite ways.
Research shows us there are at least 4 distinct faces of NPD. First, you've got the grandiose type. That's the classic stereotype we all picture. But then, almost its polar opposite, you have the vulnerable type, who hides that same grandiosity under a mask of anxiety and victimhood. The communal type is clever. They get their narcissistic supply from being seen as the most helpful or most moral person in the room. And finally, you have the most dangerous type, the malignant narcissist, where NPD mixes with antisocial traits and even sadism. 4 totally different looks, all powered by that same fragile ego.
So, if NPD is this complex, how in the world do clinicians and researchers even begin to measure it? Well, in our final section, we're going to look at the scientific, standardized tools they use to assess these traits.
Okay, first things first. These psychometric tools or personality tests are not used to give a final diagnosis all on their own. Instead, they do these 4 crucial jobs. They help identify people who might be at risk. They map out the specific ways narcissism is showing up. They support a clinician's overall judgment, and they give us valuable data for academic research.
Here are some of the heavy hitters in the field. The NPI is probably the most famous one for measuring those grandiose traits, especially in research. The PNI is a bit more nuanced. It's designed to capture both the grandiose and the vulnerable sides of narcissism. And then you have broader clinical tools like the MCMI and the PDQ-4+, which are used in clinical settings to screen for a whole range of personality disorders, including NPD.
So let's be absolutely clear on this because it's the most important takeaway here. No questionnaire can diagnose a personality disorder. They are powerful, valuable resources for screening and research for sure, but they are just one piece of the puzzle. The gold standard is and always will be a comprehensive, in-depth evaluation done by a trained mental health professional, period.
And that brings us right back to where we started. After deconstructing the clinical reality, that fragile self-esteem, the specific criteria, the different faces it can wear. How does that change the way we see the word narcissism being used as a casual label every day? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for watching.